The differences come in really in terms of some of the details. So we now have a 10 gram cubic mass below 6 gigahertz. The exposure in the 5G region, okay, used to be averaged over 20 centimetres squared. It's now averaged over 4 centimetres, which means that it's conservative by a factor of about 5 relative to 1998. There's an additional restriction for very small beams, 1 centimetre squared. Okay, so that increased temperature above those levels. So I'll flip over that. I'll flip over that.
I think there are a couple of basic mistakes I've noticed. Firstly, you said there's a limit where it doesn't affect people. Most people will probably not be affected above a certain limit, but there's no limits to certain people. Like peanuts, 1 peanut can kill a person, and yet a person can have a lot of peanuts and not be affected. Secondly, there's a woman at the Melbourne Hospital who's a professor who I asked the question, does electromagnetic radiation cause cancer? Her reply was absolutely. She's specialised in brain cancer removal.
Well, we'll take that one as a comment. But the first question, I think Rodney can answer because you've done work with electrosensitivity.
Certainly. Look, there's certainly a lot of people who claim that they are sensitive. The issue is really about trying to work out whether they're actually sensitive to the fields. And the bottom line is that as soon as you remove knowledge about when the exposure is on or off, no difference is seen.
That's not true. Heart rate variability studies.
We don't want any people shouting out, please. So, and please keep your questions relevant to the standard section too.
So this has been looked at in great detail, and certainly it's ICNIRP's position that there is no evidence of that. There are reports of it, certainly, but they are really reports that are not sufficient to actually provide information that would enable us to conclude that people are actually sensitive to it.
How do you define evidence? If I go to my local library and I sit for half an hour, I get massive headaches and I want to vomit. I sit on my computer, and the local library's got a lot of Wi-Fi. I go to my home, I sit in front of the computer for an hour, nothing happens. Explain that to me, sir. Have I got to start lecturing about libraries?
This is not to do with the standard directly, so I think perhaps have a conversation during the break would be the best way to go. Did you have a question?
I've got lots of questions.
Well,
and I'll be respectful, okay?
Firstly, an observation, because you started your presentation with a safety bar, and you said above that limit clearly you have a hazard, and below that level you're safe, and then you said later on that it's a grey area and there isn't a fixed level. So I think that you need to update your presentation because you're just misleading.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, so that was a question. So
okay. So yeah, so that's there. So I didn't actually say that that there is harm above. I presented that merely to show that you can go below. But the bottom line is that, like what was shown in the second figure, you can go lower and it won't provide any additional protection because it's already protective. But you can also go higher, which is unlike the example in the car park.
But if I go in my car to 2.1 metres, my car's going to get damaged. If I go to 2.05 metres, my car's going to be free. It is a very binary system, and that's not the standard, so you are misleading. The standard doesn't...
I think that's a comment.
It is a comment, sorry, so I'm moving on. I think it would be fair to say that because... I'm interested how you get to the question of evidence and what you consider evidence, because something like cancer is so multifactorial, it's really hard to say direct cause and effect.
So your question is, what evidence does ICNIRP use in order to set standards?
He's the one asking the question. Let him ask the question.
Well, I mean, the question is, what do you consider evidence?
Well, so in the guidelines we talk of substantiated evidence. Okay. Now it is a difficult thing. Essentially, there's no equation or algorithm you can put something through and be guaranteed that you're going to get a nice clean result. So expertise does need to come into it. But basically what we're talking about are things like, can you actually reproduce this? So for instance, with ionizing radiation, if we give a group of animals a particular dose, compared to the unexposed animals, and we see an increase in a particular type of cancer. Okay, we report that. Then someone tests it, they try to replicate it, they do the same study. What we see is that the next study finds an increase as well. Okay, so we talk of that as replication. And that's one of the really important things in science, because it's very difficult to get all of the methods right all of the time, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really help us if someone just says, well, I found this and you found that, so I want you to believe me and not them. So the idea is you've got replication, you have a lot of knowledge about what it actually takes to do a study correctly. Okay, so we know a lot about statistics and probability when something is different to just tossing a coin and getting ahead. We toss a coin and get ahead, we wouldn't find it so remarkable. If I told you I can predict the future and tossed a coin and got ahead, you wouldn't be that convinced. But if it was something a lot more complicated, you might be more convinced by it. So there are things like this, double blinding versus single blinding versus no blinding. Exposure assessment, actually knowing that there was a difference between the two studies becomes important. There's a very large range of things that need to be taken into account. And this, when you put it all together, is what we're talking about when we say there is actually evidence for something.
So I acknowledge that, and I understand what you're saying, despite the fact that Ramazzini Institute pretty much replicated the NTP study. But that therefore means that the presentation you've given is not satisfactory to be used as a health safety standard, because you're basing your results and your conclusions on firmly evidenced results where health and health risk assessments have to be based on probabilities and on risk exposures and on outcomes to unknowns. That's how risk assessment and risk management works. It doesn't work on binary outcomes. We need to be protected from heating effects. I'm not disputing that. But it comes down to questions of, I mentioned heart rate variability studies, which do demonstrate that there's a biological effect with or without an RF exposure at fairly low levels. But then can we draw that that's a health impact, or is that just a biological impact? So I would suggest that the work that you've done can't possibly be used to set health exposure limits. What would you say to that?
That's a suggestion. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I can't help. One quick thing, just a clarification, is that the Ramazzini didn't actually replicate the NTP study. Yeah, okay.
So is anybody going to be doing that replication? Is anybody funded to do that?
Yes. I'll tell you about that. So,
Thanks for your presentation. I've got 3 questions, if I may, Mr. Chair. So maybe you can do them one at a time. So the first question is in regard to medical implants. So you mentioned at the start of your talk that these were to be excluded out of the scope of the guidelines. I'm not quite sure I understand what that means. So does it mean that somebody with an implant, the guidelines no longer apply to them at all, or what does that mean?
It means that the responsibility is the medical, sorry, the person who is medically responsible for them is responsible for that. Okay? So we cannot provide the complexity required to evaluate whether they are going to be safe or not, because it's so idiosyncratic. So it's not something that ICNIRP will say you are bound. Well, it won't say that you are necessarily protected against that. It is up to the medically responsible person to make that call.
But what, so what criteria would a medically responsible person use, though, to evaluate safety? I mean, would they use, for instance, the localised SAR limits, or would they use a temperature rise? I mean, is there no advice to those medical people?
There are some guidelines out there. Basically, because it's outside our scope, we don't look at that and provide any advice on that. I don't know if there's anything satisfactory. I would imagine it's not that satisfactory, and I would think that's an important area that needs to be looked at in the future, because it does seem to be something that, it's introducing complexity into the world that just can't be dealt with a simple guideline, and yet there's possibility of fatigue, which can be hazardous to those people. So it's not something that we do, but it would seem very important to me that it is looked at in more detail.
So that was 2 questions.
So no, that was the first question. The second one was in regard to reduction factors. And so you said reduction factors, one of the things they cater for is, perhaps extreme environments like a very, hot day. So my question is, do the reduction factors also cater for uncertainty in the exposure assessment?
Yes.
Okay, and what level of uncertainty do they cater for?
We don't believe, unlike IEEE, we don't believe that there is sufficient information to specify that. So that becomes an expert judgment from the dosimetry side of things.
But okay, so say if you had an uncertainty of 10 dB, factor of 10, would that be acceptable to you? That's your whole reduction factor, all in uncertainty.
Well, all things can, well, okay, I don't know about the magnitude. That would really have to go to the dosimetry people to look at. But the overall conclusion is that because of the various levels of conservatism, a political movement, but because of the strongly conservative nature at a number of steps, that even if the reduction factor was accounted for, that would still be okay. But that's assuming how things are done at the moment, and it really comes down to the compliance community to ensure that fits in. So ICNIRP does not deal with the compliance issue per se. It requires the compliance community to set things up to meet the intent of the guidelines.
Okay.
So, well, but it's a quick one. There's some other hand there.
Just one short question. So you also mentioned that the rationale for tissue heating was that for a type 1 issue, a 5-degree temperature rise, and for a type 2 tissue, a 2-degree temperature rise. So are they almost de facto, temperature limits? So for instance, if someone were able to show that the temperature rises weren't more than 5 degrees or 2 degrees for the applicable tissue, would that satisfy the ICNIRP guidelines?
No, because that wouldn't protect necessarily against things like electroporation. So you could have a huge exposure.
Assuming that you could, discount that possibility.
Assuming you could discount all other effects,
yeah.
then you'd have the issue of, can we really be sure that at a microthermal level we're not causing any problems? Then potentially it could be, but it's not a decision that's been made because we really don't believe that there's that level of knowledge when it comes to temperature. And certainly when it comes to electroporation and very high temperature rise effects, you get effects with where bulk heating is matched, which presumably means that there are microthermal changes which can be relevant to biological effects, but we don't know. But at the moment it's just an unknown. So we'd really be jumping the gun to say, let's just assume all temperature is even, we balance it out, everything's okay. So we wouldn't do that, no.
Yeah, hands at the back. So, Darius first. There's a lady in the corner.
All right.
Hi, Robbie. I have one comment and one question. Comment is about ionizing radiation example that you have given just a moment ago. When you are dealing with ionizing radiation high levels, then always you expose animals, you get cancer, you get problems. Once you go to very, very low doses of ionizing radiation, to doses that you go into bystander effects, then sometimes you see effect, sometimes you don't see effect. So it is by comparison with EMF, when you go sufficiently high, you go thermal, you see damage, thermal damage, you go sufficiently low, you sometimes see effect, sometimes don't see effect. But for ionizing radiation, it is no radiation at all should be used, because it's anything and everything is dangerous, but for EMF, it is not so strict. So it was common. But considering the question, when you are setting safety guidelines, of course, they have to be based on knowledge. And knowledge, one could divide it into three parts. This is what we know, that we know. This is what we know, that we don't know. And finally, this is what we don't know, that we don't know. But the second part, that we know, that we don't know, which incorporates all gaps in knowledge, meaning this research that has not been done. And now question comes about millimeter waves, which will be coming with 5G. There is very few studies, really good biological studies, published on millimeter waves, few tens of studies altogether. And so we know that we don't know. So meaning, because we haven't studied it, how you use this kind of knowledge, of lack of knowledge, into saying that safety guidelines are based on science and they are reliable, when you don't know, because studies have not been done.
Look, I'm not sure why you say that the studies haven't been done. Now, if you specify, I want something at 26 gigahertz, for instance, you know, then you can say, okay, well, yes, we don't have any long-term. This is you've asked a question. I'm just responding. We can discuss over coffee if you would like. But in terms of the way that, well, okay, I guess I'd say the way that both ICNIRP and I think about this is that if you focus on one particular thing, okay, then absolutely there isn't a study that's actually tested the structural integrity of number 2 Burwood Road, okay? It's a subtly different house to every other house in the country. But we still have a lot of information, the structural engineering and so forth, the geotech, all of that we use in science to give us, to show us whether or not a particular design is going to be safe. Okay? If you want to say, but we need it specifically with long-term cancer at this particular frequency, then okay, essentially it means we've got to test every single house out there for its structural integrity. We have to, you know, a new brand of cigarettes comes out, we'll say, well, we don't know if it's harmful. You know, because of what we know about the mechanisms, how it works, we've got a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. So what we have is a lot of literature. We know how the exposure varies as a function of frequency. We have not as much as at lower frequencies, because there's been a lot of research within the ICNIRP guidelines based on telecommunications devices. But we have a lot, we know a lot. I don't know what the unknown, you know, what is the unknown that you think is there?
This unknown, what is there? For a couple of months I was searching for studies that examine effects of millimeter waves on skin. I found 103 studies. Majority of them are very small studies that are not useful for setting any safety guidelines and so on. So this is, millimeter waves will be mostly absorbed or solely absorbed by skin. When you look for published studies up to September this year on absorbed effects of millimeter waves on skin, you find about 100 studies. This is what I'm saying, studies have not been done, believe it or not. Thank you.
Okay, so look, it really comes down to if we had a good reason to think, yeah, millimeter studies on pancreas or millimeter studies on whatever were important, if there was some mechanism, some reason to think it, that would be a different story. But until we have something, then we're just looking for anything. We're just saying, okay.
Skin's pretty important.
Yeah, and we've done it, eyeballs, eyelids, etc., and we've got a very good idea of the thresholds.
The lady in the corner has been waiting for a long time.
Sorry.
A couple of questions. Can you please clarify, you indicated there was substantial evidence in relation to provocation studies, which you've been engaged in. Which is interesting, because the study that you published, you had a sample size of 3, it was 3, which is really laughable in the scientific literature, because the sample size was so incredibly small. When you look at all the rodent studies, they say, as a result of washout and the fact that many of these patients with alleged electromagnetic sensitivity have histamine levels similar to those with allergies, which means you have a delayed response. But your study ignored that possibility, despite what the rodent studies had stated, which is why most people don't actually do provocation studies to associate or even examine the impact of electromagnetic fields on human health. In relation to brain tumours,
Sorry, is that a question?
Yes. Why do you continue using provocation studies, and especially referencing your own study of n equals 3, when in scientific literature a sample size like that is really not sufficient to even draw any conclusions?
Now you see, the idea, and this really came from the EHS community in Australia, was that there were perceived weaknesses of previous studies. Okay, they thought if you fix all of these things, you will see an effect. Okay, just like you're saying, oh, but you need more than 3. Okay, they came up with a number of things. We implemented them because if we can find one person in the world who is electrohypersensitive, that's a huge breakthrough for science and for our understanding of the effect of RF. But so far we can't.
I'm one.
So what we...
Hello, I'm one.
What,
I'm one.
So what we have is a situation where a demonstration becomes really, really important. Now, there are lots of things like what you just mentioned. And so in this particular study, the idea was that we actually evoke the response. We ensure that the response is there, okay, without the RF and, with the RF when they know it's turned on, so that removes the possibility of us just not seeing it due to a delay, for instance. But it's just once the knowledge of whether the exposure is on or off disappears, their effect disappears as well. So the difference here is that to test someone in the sort of detail required to address the issues of the EHS community 4 years ago, okay, that took 3 days for a person, testing non-stop for poor Adam off the bat. Okay, it's a very big thing, and if you were to do another study, yeah, you'd test 10 or 15 people in the same time. But what we did was have the statistics to allow us within each individual to determine whether they in particular were sensitive to the RF. So it gets around the problem of a small sample size. The only issue is generalisability. Are these 3 people who aren't sensitive generalisable to other people? You might have, you might ask that question, but the results are very consistent with what others have done, and I certainly stand by it.
We
Yeah,
have
lastly,
time for-
sorry, one more question. In relation
Very
to
quick, 'cause
the
there's somebody else.
study that was published this year by our hands-on brain tumours and prevalence, that there was no prevalence of increased risk of brain tumours in Australia, but they deliberately omitted everyone over the age of 60 when most diagnoses for brain tumours occur, despite the fact that it's doubled in Sweden, Holland, UK, of course, last year it's studied, etc. So why were 60-year-old plus excluded from the study when most tumours are diagnosed in that age group?
We've got a couple of authors of that paper here, so they can answer that. Question there? Remaining question? Last question?
Okay. Thank you.
Is that working?
Yep.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we've been advised through scientific reports, and I'll just read a short section. Human sperm are damaged by cell phone radiation at very low intensities in the low microwatt range, less than 1 milliwatt per metre squared. There is a veritable flood of new studies reporting sperm damage in humans and animals, leading to substantial concerns for fertility, reproduction and health of the offspring. Now, have these assertions been discredited? Would there be a scenario of enforced sterilisation on the population? What would you recommend as a precautionary measure? And given that these levels are orders of magnitude below standards, current standards, would this be impossible without extensive revision of those standards?
Look, bottom line is that there isn't good evidence for what you've just said. There are claims. They've certainly been considered within the guidelines.
These are scientific reports, a flood of scientific reports.
So, yeah. So they've all been, yes, they've been taken into account, and it's not the best area of research, unfortunately. We do have research in Australia being conducted in that area. One of the difficulties is the dosimetry is not very. We don't actually know what dose it is. We know if you heat someone up a lot, you should get a change. But so far, there's not actually a demonstration of any change sufficient enough to cause.
Well, those are heating effects you're talking about. We're talking about biological effects here and damage to human genome, and that to me sounds like enforced sterilisation, whether it's intended or not.
Okay, well, I don't agree with the report you've just said.
So you know of the report, do you?
Well, I know the literature, and the literature doesn't conclude that. So if whoever is saying that is certainly inconsistent with ICNIRP's evaluation of the literature.
Are you absolutely sure?
So it's time for our
Thank you.
break. We can come back to these questions in the second session. Second session, we have some people with questions that have been submitted already. We'll deal with those. And the chair may take a few extra questions at that time. So back in here.
Okay.
Even though the technology is new, what comes out of it is not actually all that new. So 5G and 4G and 3G, all wireless telecommunications use radio waves. They emit radio waves. And another name for radio waves is radio frequency electromagnetic radiation or energy. Now, radiation is not actually a dirty word. People hear the word radiation and they straight away freak out. We're exposed to many different types of radiations all around us in this room, outside, everywhere. And this diagram shows you examples of different radiations. Again, all radiation is electromagnetic waves at different frequencies. We see at very high frequencies, you've got things like X-rays and radioactive sources. And in fact, most people, when they hear radiation, they straight away think of radioactive sources. As the frequency gets less, you've got UV, visible light. Right at the end, where frequencies are really low, you've got electrical power. And you can see in the diagram that there's a region going from 100 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz, and that's the radio frequency range. And that's what telecommunications operate. Now, the other thing you might notice about this diagram is it splits the different types of radiation into non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation. And I just want to talk very quickly about the difference between the two. So, I think we've all seen, so all matter can be, when you look at it in the micro level, I think everyone is seeing this diagram of an atom surrounded by, you've got the nucleus in the middle and you've got electrons flying around. Now, the process of an electron being dislodged out of its orbit, that's called ionization. Now, radiation that has enough energy to dislodge an electron out of its orbit, that can cause chemical changes, it can potentially cause DNA damage, and it can potentially cause cancer. For the first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, well, 5G as it's coming in now is operating at very similar frequencies to the 4G network. So the radio waves are very similar. In the future, it is planned for 5G to operate at higher frequencies, 26 gigahertz. Now that range has a specific name, they're called millimeter waves, because the wavelength operates at millimeters.
Mobile technology does sit at the centre of an ecosystem that's growing. Andrew just mentioned the number of subscribers, and globally we're at around, in 2018 it was about 5 billion. That's going to grow to nearly 6 by 2025. Mobile internet users is the real heavy increase. We're going to go from 3.6 billion in 18 to 5 billion in 2025. So it's a global ecosystem, it's moving at speed, and it's affecting all of our lives, but it's going to do that more and more. The different thing that is happening with 5G is that we're moving from a technology that serviced us as people by telephony, exchange of information by text, email, etc. We're moving now into this Industry 4.0 or Fourth Industrial Revolution period where we've gone through computing, we've had the advantage of steam and electricity before that, but now we're going into intelligent connectivity. And 5G will be part of that ecosystem. It won't be the sole solution, but it will be part of that ecosystem. Once again, we're expecting numbers of connections in the 5G world to increase very, very significantly as time goes. So this is the sort of the macroeconomic backdrop, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, to the evolving mobile ecosystem. It's going to lead to connected community. Sometimes it's called the networked society. It's a world where anything that can be connected will be connected. It will bring together the level of connectivity that we've, up until now, perhaps only seen on television via the likes of the Jetsons and Maxwell Smart. But this level of connectivity is going to be pervasive. It will reach every facet of how we live, and it will be significant in improving efficiencies and making life easier to live, but it's also going to be very important in dealing with some pretty substantial issues that we have along the way. It's always hard when you talk about a technology that's just been released to say, okay, what's it going to do? What are the use cases? Typically in the mobile world, we've had in the last 4 generations a pretty good sense of what the trajectory is, what we were looking forward to. But 5G is going to change that because it's introducing the concept of the industrial internet. So for the first time, in combination with 4G, I'd have to say, we're going to see an explosion of industrial-related applications and services. And those are going to play on the 3 core characteristics of 5G that are fundamentally different. Now 4G is a very, very good technology, and by the time you get to the end of the 4G envelope, you're very, very close to 5G. But there are things that 5G will do that 4G can't. Now the 3 sort of primary elements that you've got to look at are the capacity to operate with great bandwidth. Secondly, the capacity to connect billions of things. And thirdly, the capacity to offer connectivity at a latency level that we've not seen before. Typical 4G network might tick along at 30, 40, 50 milliseconds. A 5G network in its prime will take that down to 1 millisecond, a real-time network. And that's going to be incredibly important. These are the sort of the generic use cases that are being talked about in the 5G world. Enhanced mobile broadband is kind of an extension of where we've been, but it will introduce virtual reality, augmented reality, an enormous range of entertainment applications, etc. So that's kind of, in a sense, an extension of where we've been. But the other 2, massive machine and ultra reliable low latency, are where the big changes come. Massive machine is sometimes here described as the Internet of Things. These are where the volume of connected devices and things will be managed by a 5G network. Ultra reliable low latency, anything from an autonomous vehicle, mission critical applications in factories where you need incredibly low latency, remote surgery. In the Mobile World Congress event in 2019, this year, there was an operation that took place where the surgeon was on the stage and the patient was somewhere else. It's part of this evolving ecosystem. IoT will touch everything that we do in one way or another. One of the reasons that the 5G network can do this, because if you look at that slide, you think, well, it'll be in schools, we'll be using the technology, it'll be in vehicles, it'll be in healthcare, education, smart cities and smart homes. It will also be in agriculture, transport and logistics. There's not a section, not a sector of the economy where this technology won't be relevant. Always standing up. One of the things that allows that to happen is something called network slicing. We will be able to design functionality from the network to suit your specific needs. Doesn't matter whether you're a farmer or a surgeon. Of course, why is this interesting? Well, governments think it is because according to our research with Access Economics, it's probably worth around 65 billion to the Australian economy by 2023, which is not very far away. US analysts put the global impact in the trillions. This is why there's so much geopolitical interest in this technology. Just take a look at the manoeuvrings of the US and China in relation to 5G. Everybody is interested in this level of efficiency. Our analysis suggests it's worth $2,500 per person in this economy. So this is what we're looking forward to. It's going to be connectivity across the economy, across society. It will change the way we live, how we get educated, how we are served in the medical profession, and it's certainly going to be a change that will happen in the 5G generation, but don't be fooled, it's not going to stop there. There is an evolutionary path that we're on that will add connectivity to every part of our lives. Thanks, Rodney.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Chris. And now that we've got a little bit of background, I'd like to welcome Sarah Loughran. So Dr. Sarah Loughran is the Director of the Australian Centre for Electromagnetic Bioeffects Research. And she's going to be presenting on some of the things that people often ask about. With that, I'll just hand over to you. Put your mic on. There we go.
Okay, thanks, Rodney. So I just thought I'd start with, for those of you who are not familiar with what a CEBA is, and I wasn't at the event previously, is we're a National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia funded Centre of Research Excellence, and we have a research agenda that addresses the high priority aspects of the non-ionising electromagnetic energy health debate. And the way in which we do this is quite global, so we have expertise in human studies, animal studies, cellular studies, dosimetry, or looking at exposure assessments, as well as risk communication. So how do we communicate risks if risks are found, or how do we communicate if there's a lack of risk in these types of things? So that's what we do at CEBA. There's a big team of researchers doing this across Australia and also internationally as well. So mobile phones and health, what is the issue? So that's sort of what we're here to talk about. And this increasing mobile phone use that we've heard in the previous presentations as well has led to both an increase in concern but also an increase in demand for scientific research into the possibility of there being potential health effects from this type of technology. And there's a particular focus on potential effects that the radio frequency energy might have on the human brain. And that's partly because we tend to hold mobile phones, at least traditionally we tended to hold mobile phones next to our head, so our brain was the organ that was exposed the highest. And the concern is about whether there's a possibility that these effects could occur below exposure limits or guidelines. And then this ongoing rollout of 5G that we've had over the last 12 months or so has really led to a renewed focus and concern in the media around possible effects of this technology and previous technologies. So the big question is, should we be concerned? So what I'm going to do is go over what the main concerns that both ourselves as well as other organisations like our PANSA and the Department of Communications and Arts get, and talk about what the concern is and how we would respond to that concern, so what we know about the particular concern. So one of the main concerns we get is that there's lots of information and research out there that actually says that mobile phone radio frequency electromagnetic energy is harmful. So you can go on the internet and you will find something that says that. And that is true. So you can pretty much, though, find anything you want to find on the internet these days to support your own beliefs or agendas. So if you Google something, you will find it on the internet. So it doesn't mean that it's true. And the problem is that when it comes to science and research, there's a huge variability in quality, and I think Ken touched on that in his presentation before, as well as Andrew when he talked about the Vigilexby study that was published this year. So what this means is that when we look at the research out there, there's many false reports, so reports that say there might be an effect that isn't actually an effect, or vice versa, that there is an effect where there might have been an effect depending on how the research has been done, how the statistics may have been done. And there are many individual reports that lack verification, so we can certainly go out and pull out a study that says, yes, mobile phones might cause cancer, but can we pull out a study or a number of subsequent studies that validate that study? And that's one of the problems we have with looking on the internet and not being able to look at this as a whole. You'll be able to find something that says what you want it to say. So it's very important that independent organisations like the World Health Organization review all of the science together, and that puts the research and risk into context. So we can't just pick and choose a single study to say there is or isn't an effect. We need to look at these big reviews that are done by people like the World Health Organization and look to see what the consensus is there. So another concern, and a few of the talks have touched on this as well, is what do we know about mobile phones and cancer, or do mobile phones cause cancer? And this is one of the main concerns that's out there when it comes to mobile phone technology. And something that's sort of increased this concern is that in 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, classified radiofrequency fields, so the types of fields that mobile phones use, as possibly carcinogenic. And there was a lot of misunderstanding of what does that mean. Does it mean, yes, it's going to give us cancer, or possibly going to give us cancer, and how do we interpret that? And what it really means is that there's not enough evidence to show that it's not carcinogenic. And if we think about that, that can be said for just about everything in our environment. So there's not enough evidence to show that pretty much anything can't cause cancer in certain amounts. So it's not that it does cause cancer, it's just that there wasn't enough evidence to say that it doesn't. And it's important to note that despite the reports of effects on cancer, so we've seen the NTP study that Andrew presented and the Ramazzini study as well, there are actually no reports on cancer that have been substantiated. So we still don't have any evidence to suggest that mobile phone type radio frequency can indeed cause cancer. So people are also concerned, particularly with 5G, that the higher frequencies that are used, that Ken talked about, as well as the larger number of antennas. So we've seen a lot in the media that for this technology we need more antennas for it to work properly, will mean higher exposures. It's just a larger number of something must mean a larger exposure. And that's actually not the case either. So basically, I think both Ken and Andrew talked about the penetration depth of 5G higher frequencies, and what that actually means is that they'll penetrate our bodies less deeply than the previous technologies. So our internal organs will actually be exposed less than what they have been in the past as the frequencies increase. And also, with more antennas, the service is expected to be more efficient. So if we have a more efficient service, the likelihood of that is that power outputs will be reduced, and therefore that would lead to a reduction in exposure as well. So it's important not to see higher frequency as automatically meaning higher exposure. The likelihood is that the exposure will not dramatically change, and in fact could be reduced from what we have currently. There's also a concern that there's very little or no research on 5G, and we've seen in the previous talks as well, things contrary to this. So there's actually extensive research on electromagnetic energy, so we have a lot of research on this, and this includes research that's specific to mobile phone applications, so what people are most concerned about. So the reality is that we actually know a hell of a lot about this and how electromagnetic energy interacts with our body and what the mechanisms are for this interaction. And as has been said across the day as well, the only effect that we do see is a small temperature rise. And this temperature rise that we see that's associated with radio frequency telecommunications has not been shown to have an impact on health. And it's important to point out that it's a far smaller temperature rise than what we would associate with lots of other normal physiological functioning. So things like our daily circadian rhythm or our 24-hour body clock. Physical exercise will increase our body temperature far more than we would see from these types of technologies. So it's important to put it into context. And again, no health effects have been established. And lastly, another question that we get a lot is, what about those, though, that claim to be sensitive or allergic to electromagnetic energy? Are they different, or is there something different here? Do we need to look at this differently? So electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS, it has a number of different names, it's also IEI, EMF, is a self-diagnosed disorder that actually has no medical or scientific basis. The thing we need to realise, though, is that the symptoms are very real. So the symptoms that these people feel are very real, whatever those symptoms may be, but there is no evidence that these are caused by exposure to electromagnetic energy. Research in many different laboratories has consistently failed to find any association between exposure and the reported symptoms or health more generally. And there's one possibility that this EHS or this syndrome is caused by a person's expectations or beliefs that electromagnetic energy is harmful, which is also known as the nocebo effect. So we have this condition that's happening where if somebody thinks that electromagnetic energy causes certain symptoms, and then they are using their mobile phone or they find that they're more exposed to Wi-Fi in the workplace, they might start to associate, say, a headache with that exposure, and then this can then get worse across time. And so that's the only mechanism that has been shown so far in the research to be behind this condition, and no research has been able to show that these people are indeed more sensitive or allergic, or that the exposure standards would need to be changed, that there are people that could be more sensitive. So in a summary, an important feature of the new technology of 5G is these higher frequencies that are used, and that they don't travel as far from the source than the current lower frequencies that are used in 4G and 3G. It results in more superficial exposure, so we're not going to get as much exposure in those deeper organs of our body. Our current national, our PANSA, as well as our international ICNIRP guidelines include the newer frequencies that will be used in 5G technology, so a lot of people think that new 5G technology is not covered by our safety standards, but that's not the case at all. They are covered. And overall, there's no established health effects within these safety limits. So with that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sarah. And now what we're going to do is move to the panel discussion with some questions and answers. Could I ask the presenters to come and take a seat over here, please? Great, thank you. Well, maybe I'll grab some talk and back to you. Okay. Okay, so look, to get started, we asked people who would like to send some questions in to do so that we can ask the panel to address these. So far, most people said that they prefer that we read the questions out rather than those that sent the questions in read them out. But if I come to read your question and you would prefer to read it out, then just let me know and I'll pass it back over to you. So, first of all, there's a question from John Graham, which says, would a 5G wireless modem in my residence obviate the need to sign up for the NBN? Would it work as well, or is it better than the NBN? Very practical question. Look, I think for that, maybe Chris is the best person to comment on that.
It's a very common question, in fact. With the greatest respect to my NBN colleagues, it perhaps reflects on their recent history. But look, the reality is fixed networks like NBN and mobile networks are highly complementary. Despite the incredible use of mobile in our market, for example, and there are 34 million active subscriptions for 25 million people, so we're 130% market penetration here. It may interest you to know that 95% of the download traffic travels over fixed networks, not mobile. So it is very, very heavily skewed to fixed, and in fact, mobile operators tend to these days work as much like fixed network operators as possible. You send the signal from your device to a base station, the base station takes it onto the fixed network, moves it to where it's going to be, and pops it up at the other end. If all of that traffic were to move and to try and attempt to be managed via spectrum, that would be a heavy congestion load. So no, don't turn off your modem. Don't sack the NBN just yet. You need both technologies in a sense.
Thank you very much. There was a similar question which has been answered by Blake Orr as well, so I won't go to that one. Lisa Clements sent in a question. Why is it being introduced in the first place, with regard to 5G? And is it true that some countries have weaponised this technology? And I know that there's another question from Apollo, which is, why does the Army use 93 gigahertz to burn people's skin in times of conflict? I might pass that over to Andrew Wood, because I know he likes burning people's skin.
Yeah, well, the US Army did do some experiments using 93 gigahertz, and it wasn't to burn people, it was just to make them feel pain, and to stop doing what they were doing. So it's a way of controlling large crowds. And it was intended to be deployed in Afghanistan, but it never was. So I don't think the US military have ever used their so-called silent guardian. But nevertheless, they did a lot of experiments to show that it was non-lethal, which is good, I suppose, but it was effective as well. But I think there's been a fair amount of interest on the internet about weaponizing in the sense that one country can get a market advantage over another one by turning 5G into some form of a weapon. They can control technology, and one country will be the disadvantage compared to the other one. And of course, certain countries which I shan't name are engaging in surveillance of their population, looking at behaviour of individuals and putting them on a blacklist if they behave badly. And of course, 5G technologies allows that sort of thing. Well, not only 5G, but existing technology allow that sort of thing to happen. Now, the first question was also interesting. What was it?
Okay, so we had the just is it true that
Why 5G? Well, it's because people want to download their videos in 2 seconds rather than 2 minutes. People want it. I mean, it's a response to a market demand. So, I mean, you could tell people, well, you're a bit greedy wanting this, but people don't like having to wait for things. When you're navigating in the car and you're, if you use your phone, Google Maps or something, and it refuses to change its route because you've taken a turning that you think is better, you get irritated. People do. So people want the higher data rates, and they'll continue to want that. And because there are so many more people in the systems, as Chris has just said, the only way to provide capacity is to provide these greater data rates. I think Chris may want to add to that.
Look, I mean, it is part of our natural use of the technology, the extension of what we've been doing, which is perhaps heavily communication media related. But as I tried to say, there is a very, very significant industrial element that's going to come into play. And we are looking at efficiencies and productivity gains that are good commercially, yes. Are they good socially? Absolutely. Are they good environmentally? Absolutely as well. You take the agriculture challenge. In 30 years, this world is going to have to produce 70% more food than we do today to feed the population. Technology will be a critical element of doing that, because if we're not growing more land, we're going to have to use the same resources. It's critical in water management, climate change management. It's going to be critical in getting health to remote communities. No matter where you look, there is an industrial slash social slash economic rationale and environmental rationale for this technology. So while it's traffic management and what we like to do with movies in one instance, I dare say in the other instance it's going to be all about making sense of some of the messes that we're making.
Thank you. And okay, now I might go over to a question from Geraldine Doroval. I've got an asterisk here. Sorry, does that mean that Geraldine would like to read it out or not like to read it out? Is there a Geraldine in the audience?
No, you can read it.
Okay, I'll read it out. Thank you. Okay, so Geraldine said, I'd like to know about research which specifically pertains to young children's fast developing brains, given that many children under 1 year old are exposed to games, and also parents are placing phones in bassinets for white noise to assist with sleep. That's part one of the question. Sarah, since you've brought your less than 1 year old baby along tonight, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
So in terms of the research, most of the human research has been done on adults or children that are older than that. So there's not a lot out there in terms of radio frequency and very small children, but that's what we tend to use animal studies for, because in case there is a problem, you don't want to be exposing very small children. We use animal studies to determine that. And again, like a number of the presentations said, there's no reason to assume or believe that there would be any concern for smaller children. These exposures that occur from these types of devices, these devices are all obviously highly regulated, and the exposures are far below what the safety standards are, as Ken's presentation showed. So, and that's below what we would expect any health effect to occur by the mechanisms that we know. So although there's not a lot of human research in those, very, very young ages, we use other types of research, and then we have the safety factors built in to the guidelines and the safety standards, just to ensure that they are safe in case there's something that we don't know about, because we can't do the research on those very small children.
Excuse me, can I ask a very dangerous question?
Sorry.
A very dangerous question.
Would you
Who
mind
takes responsibility if medical problems occur and they're proven in 30 years' time? Does the government, a panda, the university? Who? Who takes responsibility?
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll come back to other questions after. First of all, we're going to go through the questions that people have submitted.
It's to be extremely low. Exposure from a mobile phone when used against the head is much higher than that. I mean, both are way below the limits, but exposure from smart meter is extremely low. I think measurements that have been done show that, that an exposure from a smart meter could be like your phone on a bench sending a text message or something like that. So when you consider that the exposures are at such low levels, again, there is no established health effects, including children.
Smart meters have a 1 watt transmission power.
I was expecting a more scientific answer than that from the head of that Angela. I'm actually very disappointed with that response.
Okay, so let's go on to the questions. If you have another question later, we can see if we have time to come to that.
I should mention that Rapanza are not the regulators in this space, but we do develop the standard. It's very difficult to say, is there an opt-out version, or is there an opt-out option? Remember what I said earlier in my presentation, that all wireless telecommunications emit radio waves. Now, for example, AM radio. I don't think there's anywhere that you can go.
So we don't use AM radio in our house?
Well, no, it doesn't matter whether you use it or not. It's not your radio set that's giving you the exposure. It's the waveform. It's a signal. It's the radio power from the dangles that's exposing Melbourne. Like I indicated in my presentation, when we did the Wi-Fi in school and we measured exposure in the playground, it was AM radio that had the highest exposure. So it's very difficult to say, can you have an opt-out? I don't think there's anywhere you can go where you're not going to be exposed to, for example, AM radio.
Okay.
It's still radio waves.
Can I just add, when Sarah was saying her talk about people with, electrode sensitivity, high sensitivity, it actually really upset me, and I felt like I was going to vomit, because I feel this deeply. So in our home, we have no wireless whatsoever. Well, my phone is hardwired. I only use it when it's hardwired. My internet's hardwired. The kids' iPads are hardwired. We have nothing. And to think that
it can just be discounted, and all of a sudden, like the sales manager said, it's going to be everywhere in our home. I physically don't think I'm going to be able to live. And that's a scary thought that I actually would think about potentially exiting this world. And that's a serious thing for us and our family.
Okay, well thank you for the
It's
comment.
mandated
We'll move
to
on to
protect
the
the
next.
health of all Australians, including you.
Okay, can we wait till until we finished with the questions
Can I
people have
ask one more
submitted?
thing? Just one question. Just one more thing.
Okay.
Thank you. When you say people we don't know, they might just think it's, you know, a psychological thing, that there's harm. I can tell you, if I was to turn this phone on, I feel a squeezing in my head. It feels like my head is going to explode. If I'm in an emergency situation after my phone, I will literally do it and throw it away because I actually cannot tolerate it for 10 seconds. So when you say that, that was really offensive to people in the community like myself who feel this severely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. But I think it's important to remember that here as scientists, okay, it's not up to us,
as well.
excuse me, it's not up to us to convince you one way or the other. But all that we can do, if you want to know what science is saying, we can let you know what that is, and it's up to you to use that in whatever way you see fit. But what we know is the science, and we that's our job. We can't really go beyond that. Anything, whether it's a question of whether society should stop 5G because of what you're saying, that's not to do with us. We don't decide on what society is allowed to do. That's up to society. All we can do is talk about what the science is saying, what the regulations currently are, how they approach things, so that hopefully people can understand the way the system works as well as possible. Okay, let's move on. Okay, there was one question by Robert Brzynowski, I believe. Sorry about the pronunciation. What research has been done on the recently discovered mechanism of how EMFs and 5G harms human tissue, namely the non-thermal activation of channels in the membranes that surround each human cell, known as voltage-gated calcium channels? Now, of course, there are statements here that may or may not be agreed with, but would someone like to comment on the voltage-gated calcium channels? Maybe Andrew would be the person.
Yeah, so somebody called Martin Paul from the University of Washington passionately believes that voltage-gated calcium channels are especially sensitive to environmental fields and are affected. In fact, I, as a biophysicist, know about ion channels. In fact, I'm on a PhD on ion channels. So voltage-gated calcium channels are really no different from, or very little different from, the sodium and potassium channels that make our nerves work. Certainly you need a very strong field in order to shift the gate. And there may be a bit of misunderstanding on Paul's behalf, that the amount of field that you require to shift the gate somehow relates to sensitivity. But in fact, it's the opposite.
We're reducing the potential for problems. Normally, people see that as a beneficial thing. Now, I don't understand law, and I don't know how responsibility financially can be apportioned. But personally, I would think that society is asking its experts to do the best that they can. And from what I've seen, that's what the experts are doing. So I would be surprised if society expected the experts to take responsibility in a financial or a legal sense, but that's only my guess.
I gather one thing that some of the major insurers overseas have been reluctant to underwrite.
Swiss Re call it a top 5 risk.
So that's...
Yes, certainly. I don't know.
Chris, maybe, because it's documented in quite a few places.
Yeah.
It's worth that some of the big insurance companies are currently reluctant to provide coverage.
Yeah, look, what people do is, again, you would need, I guess, a lawyer to know whether they need to do that or whether they think that maybe the chance of a lawsuit
Yeah, no one's taking
prohibits.
responsibility.
TPG CEO,
Very difficult to...
No one here.
TPG CEO said there were rational reasons to be concerned, under oath in court.
Sure. The issue really comes down then to the science, and you know, I can't comment on the legal side. If they've got evidence of harm that we're not aware of, I'd be surprised. Certainly with ICNIRP during the public consultation phase, there was a lot of opportunity for people to provide information. In general, people weren't providing, there were reference to particular studies that did something and they said that proves X when it's being considered and the conclusion was quite contrary to what the person claimed. But there certainly wasn't, you know, I know a number of countries, for instance, where there are various differences in how RF is treated. I know that they didn't provide any further evidence. They had differences of political decision. So I don't know. If there is evidence, then it would be good to know, but it's certainly been looked at in great detail.
Swiss Re report in 2013 were reluctant to 2015 CFC Underwriting, which is a Lloyd-backed insurance company, renewed its insurance policy, and the new policy excluded compensation for claims regarding electromagnetic fields, CFC Underwriting, etc. But again, as you said, this is a scientific presentation. So just one small comment. No offence whatsoever to Chris. His presentation seemed a little bit incongruous. Not quality or content, that's a different issue, but it is interesting that we've had quite a lot of other comments, including by Andrew, about economics and sociology, risk perception and whatnot. So I think the science has been interesting, but there has been, I think, a slippage in the way that the one has been directed.
Okay, we'll take that as a comment. Do we have any quick questions?
Yes. Is the panel aware of any research for the justification of the ban on Huawei?
No comment.
No, sorry, we've already gone over time, and you gave a comment, not a question. Sorry, at the back, was there a question?
Yes, my name's Alan Manson, and I submitted a question through the website.
Yes.
And I can't understand why it hasn't been read out tonight. I just want to ask, there's a lot of talk about 5G requiring foliage around every street to be cut back to enable the beams from 5G to work unobstructed. Now, is that correct?
Okay, so the two questions, look, I thought it wasn't as directly relevant to the health issue. We're running out of time, but very happy to ask them. So two questions. Will 5G require trees and or foliage to be removed from public access ways for the 5G beams to operate reliably? And if there is going to be millions of 5G small cells located around Australia and the rest of the world, etc., how many power stations will be needed to supply the power needed to run the network, and how will this affect climate change? It seems that there's an awful lot involved with that. I don't know if we have any people here with expertise on the on that particular issue.
Yes, I can assist you? I can assist you here.
Sorry.
I can assist you here, sir.
Excuse me, the idea, as I tried to explain, is for questions for the panel.
Millimetre wave spectrum, we all know, is fantastic at carrying data, but it won't go very far. So the network design is all about getting the right balance of a mix of spectrum. Some spectrum goes a long way and will go through buildings and into buildings. 5G will operate on those frequencies. But when there's intense data requirements, then millimetre wave will come in. But the thought of everyone running around trying to mitigate any level of interference with millimetre wave spectrum by trimming trees or anything else for that matter, no, is the answer to that.
It's already happening overseas.
I should say, I did actually try to minimise the number of questions going to Chris because of your comments, but let's face it, you're asking questions that it needs his knowledge to answer. Okay, and one last question. At the front here.
Hi. Okay, I did have two, but you just said one.
A question, not a comment.
Yeah, it is a question. So just in relation to the lady who's sensitive, and I'm not sensitive, but I do know a few people who are. Do you think that it would be possible to conduct some tests or some sort of study based on people who are actually physically feeling these effects? Like, can you do a study on that to put some ease to the community that you're doing something about it? Yeah.
I mean, that's actually, I gave a very brief presentation because we were short on time, but that's actually what I was referring to. So that's actually been done a number of times in a number of different ways. Ourselves, we've done a number of studies as well. So lots and lots of studies have been done. Even that's how we're able to say that there isn't any evidence that it's the electromagnetic field causing this. Yes, the symptoms are real and the symptoms can be measured, and things like pain, or we could use different measures to see that yes, this person is suffering, but there is currently no link that shows that this pain or whatever they're reporting is caused by the electromagnetic field. So there's lots of studies that have been done, and consistently they show that there isn't a link.
So if the person is in like a Faraday cage away from all forms, would you be prepared to have, say, I don't know what your test studies are, but someone had 3. Let's say if there were, say, 50 people who would come forward to actually go through an actual test, because I really have a lot of compassion for this lady down here and also a few of my friends. So you say that there's nothing you can do, but I feel that you can. Would you be able to invest a little bit of time to actually put some rest for the community? Yeah.
I mean,
do you think that's fair?
There's lots of things that can be done, but there's also lots of things that have already been done, and it's very difficult to get people to want to participate in these studies because they are suffering and they don't want to be exposed to things for a start. And
oh no, but they're already exposed. This is the point of them being sensitive. So it's not like you're putting them through a traditional test, it's just whether or not they're experiencing, and then in giving them an environment where they're not exposed, so it's a safe environment, to test that.
We've actually already done that as well.
Right,
so we have
cool.
a Faraday cage, and we've done it in a Faraday cage, we've done it outside of Faraday cages, we've done it in people's homes. So we've done it in a number of different locations ourselves as well as other researchers, and the results are always the same.
Is there a way for you to educate the community if they want to conduct their own tests? So a guideline?
Never.
They're very bad.
Yeah.
Okay. We
Thank
will
you.
have to leave it at that.
Thank
so
you.
if you'd like to continue discussing, of course, you're welcome to come and have a bite to eat and a drink and again talking. Thank you very much for coming along this evening, and hope at least you have a better understanding of how we see the world, and I hope hopefully it's worked out for you.